Welcome to the 35th episode of the Hail Mary podcast. I'm A. Toves, and I'm joined by my husband, the Toves. We're back to give our hot takes and throw some Hail Mary shots downfield for our listeners to love or hate. Let's get started. What a crazy game. UTSA lost a nail-biter in triple overtime, 37-35. The game started out as a defensive slugfest, with both teams scoreless in the first quarter. The runners took what looked like a commanding 21-7 lead entering the fourth quarter, but Houston would not go away that easily. An uncharacteristic mistake by the Roadrunners negated a crucial fourth down stop. Houston used that change in momentum to score a touchdown. They followed that up by causing an interception and turning that into a game-tying touchdown. After the Roadrunners were forced to punt, Houston drained the clock in a long drive, resulting in a field goal to take a 24-21 lead, seemingly sealing the victory. But in reality, the fun was just about to begin. Frank Harris marched the team down the field in a drive that took less than 30 seconds and gave Jared Sackett just enough time to kick a field goal that sent us into overtime. After trading field goals in overtime number 1, both teams scored touchdowns and completed their 2-point conversions in the second overtime, sending us to a third overtime, where each team had one shot at a 2-point conversion. Houston's quarterback somersaulted into the end zone to seal the victory. A heartbreaker for the Roadrunner fans, but man, what a game. What were your thoughts on the game?
College football's back. I mean, this is what we miss, right? Like, for 8 months of the year, this is exactly what we miss. We have recruiting, we have all sorts of other stuff going on, spring ball, but nothing beats getting to that first game, especially a home game in this case, seeing all the tailgates, walking into the dome, seeing all this red-clad fans, all the Houston Cougar fans there, and man, I just, I missed it. I mean, I walked in, I saw everybody, and I was like, I really missed this, and the game didn't let me down. I mean, I want to say it was really billed more as a Houston versus UTSA, but it really came down to Clayton Tune versus Frank Harris.
Right.
Like, who's going to blink first? Who's going to not convert first? And, to be honest with you, that was exactly what I wanted as a UTSA fan. If I'm going to trust one player on UTSA's team, it's going to be Frank. So I would say in that respect, it didn't let me down at all.
Yeah, I know that the fans probably are feeling frustrated at the end of this game because, again, we had so many opportunities to pull off a victory, and it didn't happen. But, looking back at this game, even after watching it a second time, I don't leave this game feeling disappointed or, worried about the rest of the season. I mean, honestly, looking at the way that we played, and just that level of play on the field, I feel pretty encouraged about the rest of the season. I mean, sure, there were mistakes that were made. There's issues with coaching that we'll get into. But overall, I think this sets us up pretty well for a great rest of the season. Because at the end of the day, whether we won this game or we lost this game, if our goal is to get to a Conference USA championship, the result doesn't matter. This game isn't going to help us get to the conference championship, and it's not going to keep us from that. So we still have the ability to achieve our goals.
I'll add this. I know there was all this talk about moral victories. There's no moral victories, blah, blah, blah. Look, this isn't the Coker or Wilson era where, you had to have 10 things go right, and they all had to go right in order for us to pull the upset. And then, 8 of the 9 would go right, and then we're like, we needed those one or last 2 things to go right, and that's why we lost. It was really felt, I think, more in the Wilson era, like Arizona State. This one was similar. We need 10 things to go right, except in this case, it was more like 1 or 2 things maybe went right, if even those 2 things went right, and yet UTSA had every opportunity to win this game. And yeah, it's frustrating, but, to your point, if anything, this should just, I think, re-energize you for the season, because this is exactly what we thought that UTSA would come out and look like. I mean, I said in the preview, Jeff Traylor teams in his only 2 season openers, I should say, that were both on the road, have come out with energy. They've come out playing well. And so any question you had about them was answered in that first game temporarily, right? Like some of those things are still long-term issues that you're still going to have to solve. But they're always answered in that first game. And you're like, wow, this team can really do some damage. And, in the COVID year, they went 7-4, essentially had an opportunity to challenge, I think, for the conference championship, made a case for it and, lost to UAB, so didn't get that chance. To come back last year, again, came out with great energy, beat up on Illinois, and here we got a conference championship out of it. This season, they come out, yes, they lost, but man, it was... I just wouldn't put this on the players. I think they did put everything out there. It's just sometimes this is just what happens, right? Like we've
had a lot of close games, and a lot of them have gone our direction, but you can't expect every close game to go that way. And I know when you look at these games, it's easy to focus on the last mistake, and to focus in this game on what happened at the very end with the 2-point conversion. But it's never the last mistake that's really the reason that you lost the game. There were 5 other mistakes that led you to that point. So I know it's really easy to kind of focus in on that 2-point conversion, but there were a couple of things that led to that point that we'll get into further when we kind of dive into the offense and the defense that got us to the reason we were there in the first place. But I don't think you should walk away again from this game thinking that was the biggest issue. I mean, there were little issues along the way, but at the end of the day, we still played well. We still have a lot to build on, and now we know what we need to clean up for the rest of the season before we get into conference play.
Right. I mean, there was a lot of questions we had in our imperfect season preview, right? And some of those, I think, are beginning to get answered, and some of them, I think, are going to be the long-term issues that you just kind of mentioned. And so I think, you, especially coming from this game, there's certainly a lot of positives to take out of it. And if they continue playing with this type of energy, it's going to be hard to lose too many games, especially in Conference USA, regardless of the opponent. You can give us UAB, you can give us Rice at the low end of the spectrum. Doesn't matter. They're coming out with energy, and I just satisfying to see what Traylor has built in terms of culture and what he has built in terms of his team, because it really is quite talented. But here's one thing I do want to focus, and maybe we can talk about this just a little bit, is Jeff Traylor after the game and his post-game interviews was like, he sounded like he had just lost either the conference championship, the national championship. I mean, he really seemed down. Mm-hmm. I was a little bothered by it because this is game 1. There's 12 games, right? And You're not even talking about, to your point, this loss does not determine whether we go to the conference championship or not again. So, at least for me, I'm more of an even-keeled person, so I don't always understand this, like, Jeff Traylor just going either too high or too low. Mm-hmm. And this was felt like too low. But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I was bothered by how he reacted after the game, just again, because he felt very, very low. But I was more concerned today in his media roundtable that he still seemed kind of down on himself and just down on how everything had transpired. Because at the end of the day, we have another game on Saturday. And it's going to be very tough for different reasons. It's on the road. You kind of just have to shake it off, and move on to the next game. And my concern is that his feelings will then impact the feeling of the team. And if the team's not dialed in, if the team can't just let this go and move on to the next game, then, that could become problematic because we have a very tough game coming up on Saturday. It's a completely different type of game, different style of play, and it's going to take all of their focus and all of their execution. And so it just bothered me to see him, in the moment after the game. Okay, that's one thing. Again, I prefer that he be more even-keeled, but, he's an emotional guy. That's how he handles things. But to see that again today was just a little concerning.
Yeah, and like I said, I'll say it again. I mean, since I'm more of an even-keeled person, I just don't get the high highs and low lows. And to me, to me, hopefully there's no hangover for
Right.
Army. And I think that's really where you're trying to kind of highlight. And we both share the same concern is, are we flying, because we will be there in person, so are we flying up to New York and seeing still sort of a dour face and still kind of thinking about what could have been in the dome, on September 3rd, instead of what's happening, essentially September 10th,
right,
at West Point. So
I mean, we saw that before with the letdown at North Texas, and then coming back and being focused for the conference championship. Hopefully, these guys can do that again, because they are going to need that level of focus and that level of execution to be successful this week.
Yeah. So again, at least from our viewpoint, let's hope that there's some spirits that go up. All right. Anything else you want to talk about in the game? Anything that caught your eye before we really get into the breakdowns?
Nothing I don't think we can say for that.
Okay. So let's start with the special teams. I'll say this. Like, I was concerned, I think, about our new special teams coach, but I felt like, well, maybe there's just going to be a little bit of a learning curve, so I'm going to give him a break. The second punt of the game, and essentially Lucas Dean had a pretty good punt, but Tank Dell broke the coverage and went for a touchdown. Now, it came back, and at the time I was happy about it because I was like, Houston fans were celebrating around me. But looking back at it, it felt like sort of a weak block in the back call.
Mm-hmm.
Look, we'll take it. I'm not trying to get on here and say, we won't accept any sort of either weak calls or strong calls, right? We're not going to differentiate between the two, but certainly I think it let him slide until we got to, and we can talk a little bit about it now, is that fourth down call. 4th down and 1, Houston Cougars on their own 34. Dana Holgerson said post-game that he felt like they needed to go for it at that point because they could not get the ball back to the Roadrunners, especially down 21-7 with, I think it was about 5 minutes left in the third quarter. Just couldn't happen. So they went for it. And to be honest with you, it was just a bad call. Like, they did this little pitch out to the left, and the Roadrunner defense held. I mean, they swallowed that up. There was 3 Roadrunners in pursuit. All was right in the world.
Except what we didn't realize at the time was that there had been this miscommunication, and Cephas and the special teams coordinator apparently thought they were going to punt, so Cephas was on the field. Hence the illegal substitution call.
Here's where we have to criticize Traylor. And here's where he did hold himself accountable to it. So it's not like we're unfairly doing it. You have to be aware of what's going on, and you have to use your timeout at that point. Even if it means that they end up converting on it because they make a better call, you have to call the timeout. Okay.
Because what ended up happening was they called the timeout after the penalty, and it just seemed like a waste at that point. Like, it seemed like they were just very confused.
Right, and then that's where I think this criticism has to really center itself on when you're talking about this play, because this play wasn't what lost the game, to be honest with you, to me.
But it certainly was a momentum shift.
Sure, but it was compounded more by the fact that Traylor was making some sort of motion to the referees after the penalty was called, and then the defense goes back out there and they're not prepared, so they have to waste the timeout you just referenced. Mm-hmm. That's on Traylor, that's on Lepp, that's on Burke. One of those 3 guys has to know what's going on, and in this case, Lepp should know what the hell's going on. His team is still out there, his group is out there, so you just have to shift a few players. They just called the penalty. It's a first down. How you don't have the call ready, how you're not ready to go, is just beyond me. And I think that it goes back to the question that we have about Chess Lepp. I don't understand how he's not ready for this. And I think this is where the emotional Traylor also costs you some, because instead of focusing at that moment on, okay, so we had 12, whatever, review it after the game and figure it out. But once they call the penalty, it's not like you're going to be able to change the official's mind, move on to the next play. And that's what he tells his players to do. At that moment, he didn't do that. And I think that we have to squarely, and that's why he did take accountability, but that just compounds the issue more that you waste the time out there.
But let's talk about the other things that did go right with special teams. Because again, this was definitely a question mark going into the season. The things that we saw that went well were the fact that Sackett kicked it off and it either went into the end zone or was pretty close into the end zone. When it was returned, when the kicks were returned, we managed to stop them, behind where they would have, started had they just kneeled the ball.
Minimal gains, yeah.
Sackett was cool, calm, and composed in both of his field goals. And, those were critical moments, in the game.
And I'll add, because it's always like an overlooked thing, but Lucas Dean is such a good holder. Like, he's a great punter, but even the commentators on the broadcasts mentioned the way he spun the ball on that last, I think it was the overtime kick.
It was the overtime,
kick.
Yeah.
He essentially got the laces out. Those are little details that we take for granted, but I want to bring it up because, again, to your point, little details that the players did right that could have avoided any sort of issue in the game.
And then let's talk about my favorite. I guess you can call it a special teams play because I don't know where else to pull it.
It's fine.
But the punts where the offense was on the field and it looked like we were about to go for it on fourth down, and then who kicks the pooch punt? Brendan Brady. Like, what the heck? I mean, we've seen Brendan Brady throw passes, we've seen him catch passes, we've seen him run the ball, and now we've seen him punt. Like, I mean, what else can he do?
So he's a Swiss Army knife.
Apparently.
But I guess we also found our backup punter, right? Like,
I know, that's true.
We'll see.
We haven't seen our actual backup punter, but now we know. We just throw in Brendan Brady, pooch punt, and then you got, Zakari pinning him down at the 1. I mean, apparently our offense should be all special teams. We got that going for us.
Well, I mean, I'll say this about Brendan Brady. I mean, again, it was a good punt. It threw Houston off. It reminded me of the second game that UTSA ever played when Hal Mumme was doing that to UTSA, where he'd essentially go empty backfield and had his quarterback get the snap, and then you didn't know on fourth down whether he was going to actually go for it or actually punt it. He would end up punting it every single time, but there was that sort of I don't know aspect to it. And so I think that was a terrific play and probably something they'll call back to at some point. But they covered it well, and it was well done because it came near the end of the first half, and it forced Houston to have to run plays, and they couldn't just kneel it because they were at the 1. So, well done.
I mean, the one thing that you can say for Traylor is he always throws in these trick plays, but unlike our previous coaches, they make sense and they work.
Well, it's because they practice it. It's the details, right?
Right.
And we'll get into some more of that here in a second, but let's go over to the offense. Overall, I thought the offense wasn't great overall as a unit. There was a lot of faultiness to it. And I think that really, if you look at the offensive performance, it's really down to just one guy. It's Frank. Like he was why the offense succeeded, despite some of the things that were going wrong for him. He had O-line issues. He had to deal with some uncharacteristic Zakari Franklin drops. And yet, he still took us down the field in 23 seconds and was able to tie it up. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think overall, they performed well. I thought Stein did well. I think it took him a little bit to get into the game, but then I think he found a rhythm with Frank. And there was these short passes that they had to use to combat Houston's defensive line that was penetrating over and over and over. So, I said before that I felt like that Frank is best in a West Coast type of offense where it's a short pass, kind of maybe a little bit more up-tempo. I didn't like that they were in up-tempo because of the fact that I think it didn't let the clock run as much as they could have.
Right.
But they had to do it in order to kind of keep Houston off balance because Houston was actually really subbing out plenty of their front seven even though they have a talented starting unit, maybe too deep, I would say, at the defensive line, early in the game, they were subbing in and out. And, UTSA does that. And they do it to just keep their defensive line fresh for the entire game. And it worked because, the end of the game, I mean, their top players were in there, I think, 100% of the time. It seemed like D'Anthony Jones was there like the entire time. But I just felt like they really caused problems for this offense. So let's start out with the offensive line because that's really the most glaring issue here. They really couldn't handle that Houston defensive line, and that was an area of concern for us going into this game.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the things we said, again in our season preview was, can this O-line stay healthy? And unfortunately, 2 drives in, Mekhi Hart gets hurt. And now it looks like he's going to be out for, multiple games, unfortunately. And his backup is Almaraz, who's hurt. So we end up with Frankie Martinez sliding over and playing in a position that is not really his natural position. It's not the one that he's probably spent a lot of time practicing at. He did a good job for having to come in such a tough situation. But unfortunately, we're playing one of the best defenses that we're going to face all season. So, there were a couple of times where, obviously the pressure got to Frank, and this is when it's good to have Frank in that role because he's able to scramble in a way that most other quarterbacks wouldn't. And frankly, other quarterbacks on our roster, I mean, if you put Eddie Lee in that position, he probably would have gotten sacked much more than Frank did. I think Frank had maybe 2 sacks in the entire game. But I think that says more about Frank than it does about our O-line.
Well, I mean, the O-line they were a sieve. They just couldn't give Frank enough time. I mean, no, that's more of a general statement. There were times where they held, but it was really kind of few and far between, excuse me. And because of it, you've got to just circle that and say, like, this is a problem. This is one of those issues that we now know is going to hamper us for the rest of the season. But I'm going to go back to something you said. Like, they just can't stay healthy. And This is why we had pretty much said that this line was good for Conference USA, but overall is not very good. And even with Mekhi Hart in there, they were having problems blocking that defensive line. There was no running game to even look at when Mekhi was in there. And I know it was only like a few plays, but there weren't many holes that were being open. And, Mekhi going down didn't change, I think, the course of the game so much in terms of would they have would the Houston line have not gotten as much penetration? I still think they would have. Like that's just the way that things go.
But the one bright spot of the O-line, and one of the questions you had going into the game, was Maka and his snapping, and no snap issues.
Yeah, knock on wood. Who did have a couple of snap issues? Houston did.
Yeah.
Houston had some issues with that, and I thought that threw them off a little bit on some of those plays because I believe that they had a couple of incomplete passes on the ones where they had some errant snaps. So I think the takeaway here with the offensive line, it is going to be an area of concern moving forward. What won't be, I think, is Treylon and Brendan in terms of the running game. I think, again, facing such a good defensive line, it was going to be difficult for them to really get any running space. So I think moving forward, they'll be able to find some sort of space, and we'll see a running game a little bit more reminiscent of some of the offense that we saw last season, but I think that there's some good wrinkles that I saw during this game that I think it really got me encouraged. I will say the wide receivers also played well, aside from Zakari. I mean, if I'm going to bang on anybody, I'd say Zakari just seemed like he was affected by that Houston secondary, but I think you saw something that you want to mention.
Very early in the game, there was something that was said between Zakari and one of the Houston players in the secondary, and they, kind of started to snap at each other, and then the next play is the one where Zakari dropped the pass. I think it was the first pass that he dropped in the game. And he just looked like whatever that guy had said to him had gotten in his head. And if you notice, it took, every time they went to go tackle Zakari, when he did catch the ball, there were like 3 or 4 of them on top of him. So it just felt like they kind of got to him and they got in his head a little bit. Towards the end of the game, it seemed like he had kind of gotten past it. But at the very beginning, it certainly seemed to me more of some kind of chippiness that had happened on the field rather than, really an issue with Zakari, other than he just let them get to him.
Yeah, and I think that first drop by Zakari was the one that really bothered me the most because it looked like he either didn't expect it to come his way, but he seemed to be going at less than 100%.
Yeah.
And I think that really ticked off Traylor as well because it was a lack of essentially attention, and that's just not what...
It's very uncharacteristic for him.
And it's also just not good for a Traylor coach team. Like, he preaches the fact that they are paying attention, that they have an attention to detail. So, certainly a problem. I will say that Jonathan Cephas, just kidding, Josh Cephas and JT Clark are exceptional. That's just a reference to the CBS announcers. They kept calling him Jonathan Cephas. I think Mama Wisdom kind of called that out.
I think we should blame Jonathan Cephas for the little issue with the illegal substitution. Josh Cephas was amazing during the game.
Jonathan Cephas is a slacker. Doesn't know what his roles are.
That's right.
Josh Cephas does. All right. I will say then Oscar was Oscar. Fantastic. That catch that he made right before the game tying field goal. I don't know if there's a tight end in UTSA history that makes that catch at his size in that moment.
Even the commentators had said on TV, like, that's like an O-lineman out there catching the ball. Like, they were just amazed.
There was a number that fell off his jersey. There's a 5, 6, or 7 that's missing on there. But fantastic. Oscar, and I say Oscar being Oscar because you expect the great blocking, but those soft hands to make that catch, just amazing.
And I know you love the fact that on that last drive, Frank threw twice straight up the middle.
I'm going to get to this because I thought Frank was exceptional in this game. I know that maybe he wasn't as flashy as he has been, like in maybe the Western Kentucky game, about 11 months ago. But I thought he conducted the offense well. I thought he was looking for the right receivers. There's always going to be a few plays here and there where you're like, oh, that wasn't the best decision, Frank, But, I felt like overall we got a very good game from Frank, which I thought was interesting because JJ and Greg Luca do this post-game interview, and Greg Luca said that he didn't think that this was the best, like a very good game from Frank Harris. And I just wholeheartedly disagree. Frank was looking down the middle to what you just referenced. He was 4 for 4 on passes, essentially 10 plus yards down the middle. That's uncharacteristic for Frank. Frank doesn't make those throws. So I think the LASIK worked because he
barely can see now.
He made those passes, and those were passes that just he didn't throw before. And obviously it was probably some calls from Wilstein, but that throw to Josh Cephas to start off that drive, I would say the second play to start off that drive, 23 seconds left in the game, he doesn't make that throw a couple seasons before. If he does, there's nothing behind it, or it's off, and we're still at the 25-yard line. That throw to Oscar, he doesn't make that throw previous seasons, but the one throw that to me really epitomizes just how good Frank looked in this game was a JT Clark touchdown pass in overtime, because it was the narrowest of windows, and Frank is not, at least in the last couple seasons, has not been a guy that has been trying to fit something in the window that small. He did it. He did it against, to me, what's a good secondary. Maybe not as great as their secondary was last season, but he fit that ball in there for only JT to catch. And of course, if anything, JT's not going to drop that pass, and he made a great play on the ball. I can't stop gushing about Frank because it really felt like he did a great job in this game, and he he kept UTSA in this game. And like I said at the beginning, it was a Clayton Tune, Frank Harris showdown, and I felt like Frank held his own in this.
Well, and that's where I think, maybe those comments from Luka having happened immediately after the game, sometimes the last thing you remember is the last play where, we didn't make that pass for the 2-point conversion. We lost, and Frank's blaming himself for that play. So I think sometimes it's kind of that recency bias rather than looking at the entire game. And I think there was more wrong with that 2-point conversion than just Frank not putting Zakari in motion or something. Like it just seemed like there were a lot of mistakes on that final play.
A big coaching mistake because UTSA had already used up their only timeout in that overtime. So, it's certainly one that they're going to want to go back and wish they had, and that's what Traylor had said post game. But I will say that just to cap off the Frank discussion, if there's any other way for him to grow his legend at UTSA, let's see, going down, and I'll say 23 seconds, but it really was about 18 seconds that he went down the field, to set up the game-tying touchdown. I didn't think he could grow his legend any further, but that right there sealed it. And honestly, they lost 45 seconds because of the fact that there had been a play where one of the running backs had been essentially tackled on the ground. And so they hadn't blown it dead, and they let the clock run. They never put that time back. So this is what's going to hurt a little bit more, because even though the illegal substitution play happened, if we get some of that time back,
instead of a field goal, we might have had time for a touchdown.
Frank hits a touchdown pass. I don't care what a Houston fan says. I don't care what any UTSA fan says either. He has more time, and he hits those 2 passes like that. He's essentially got about 30 seconds, if not more, to try to find a receiver in the end zone. So let's go on to the defense. Look, I think the story of the game wasn't, again, I've been kind of talking about it, but the story of the game was not just that illegal substitution. It was the fact that the defense just couldn't get Houston off the field on third down. They kept converting over and over. Starting at the fourth quarter, they went 7 for 9 on third down conversions for the rest of the game. So that's fourth quarter and overtime. Even before then, they had gone 6 for 12. So Houston was not the juggernaut that we thought they were going to be passing-wise. They came out and ran the ball, and I think that that's really what is also part of the other story, which is that they just kept battering our defense. Mm-hmm. They wore our defense down. They got us tired. They couldn't do the substitutions, really, that I think that we would have wanted to do. And even so, they did exactly what Army would possibly do, which is wear you down, and then you get a bunch of big plays. By the end of the game, you could see the fact that the defenders were having problems catching up to Clayton Tune. I know Clayton Tune is fast, but he's not Frank Harris fast. I just don't see that this defense couldn't have stopped him a few times. I refuse to believe that. It's just that they were, by that point, winded. They had been that defensive line. I'll start out with them. It's the unit we thought they'd be. I'm going to go right now. Joe Evans, Brandon Brown, Cyrus Simon, Lamont McDougall, Brandon Matterson, Christian Clayton, and Tremaine Bell were just causing havoc. That defensive line is for real. They gave problems to a good, possibly great G5 team in Houston. I just can't imagine what they're going to do to Conference USA, and I think this is where Conference USA teams might be shaken already, because this defensive line is loaded. I mean, I think there's even guys that I didn't mention at all that might have played, and
yeah, it seemed like almost the entire defense played at least a couple of snaps.
I couldn't stop gushing about Frank. I can't stop gushing about the defensive line. Joe Evans was the transfer that we had talked about from LSU. He's going to be missed at LSU because their top defensive lineman just went down for an injury last night. You can see the talent in Joe Evans. He was manhandling some of these Houston offensive linemen. Now, Houston's offensive line was rebuilt as well, but they seem beefier, much sturdier than the UTSA offensive line. But I got to say that they were being pushed around. And at one point, I believe it was Lamont McDougall was getting triple-teamed. Mm-hmm. You heard me right. Triple-teamed. That means that they're going essentially one-on-one with, it had to be Joe Evans and potentially Cyrus Simon, which is exactly what UTSA's defense would want. I mean, this defensive line just did a fantastic job. I wish we would have been able to make just a couple more plays on Clayton Tune. Linebackers did great. I thought Day in particular was terrific, but you liked another Taylor brother.
Yeah, I thought Danye had a really great game. I mean, that was probably the best game we've seen from Danye ever. And, he seems like someone, in the next year who is really going to develop, and, we'll have him for at least one more season. So it was really excited to see his growth. And, it was fun to see both of the Taylor brothers on special teams together on the kickoff return. So
just for the listeners out there, during the game, Atos could not stop gushing about the Taylor brothers. Like, it seemed like every other word coming out of her mouth was either Day or Danye. She just was like, they're everywhere. They're everywhere.
Yeah, they were having a really, great game. And, I thought one of the questions going into the game was, are we going to have linebackers, edge rushers that are quick enough to get to the quarterback? And, we saw a lot of pressure on Clayton Tune that I don't think we fully expected to see.
No, there was definitely some tweaks by Just Lep that I thought were very good. But, I think this defensive line is just otherworldly. And I think they're going to free up so much space for this linebacking crew to make so many more plays. We haven't even mentioned Trevor Harmonson or Jamal Ligon.
Right.
Like,
we just kind of take them for granted.
They weren't too bad.
Yeah.
No, really. They did play well. But seriously, like, you don't mention them because there was just so many other players that really popped on the field. So that brings me to the secondary. And talking about popping, to me, if any UTSA fan didn't notice Nick Troy Fortune, the West Virginia transfer, then you weren't really paying attention, or maybe you just need to look off the ball, because he was fantastic. His coverage was terrific. Fortune really is as advertised. I'm really excited about him. While Atos was talking about the Taylor brothers, I was watching Fortune. He can tackle. He can cover. Man, we haven't had a corner like this in a while. And
Sure.
We've had some pretty talented corners coming through. And I think, again, we talked about some of the positives coming out of this game. And this defense looks special for Conference USA. I mean, I had kind of mentioned it during the preview, but this really sealed it. Like, this team looks really good going into Conference USA. We just have to get through 2 more tough games and, just I think get healthy, and this team can really do some big damage, because this defense looks for real.
Yeah, my only frustration was just with all the number changes at times. Some of the guys had taken new numbers, like Fortune had taken number 10, and Trumaine Bell was in number 15. So at times I was like, wait, who is that? What's going on? I needed like a printed cheat sheet of all of the roster or something. Should have saved it on my phone, because Wi-Fi in the Alamo Dome is terrible. But anyways.
Yeah, I mean, look, and to say all that, once again, we're going to highlight someone that seemed pretty quiet, and that was Rashad Wisdom. Like, Rashad was incredibly quiet. And I'm not saying that he had a bad game.
Yeah,
I'm just
he
saying
just didn't
that,
have those big plays like we're used to seeing.
Right. But, again, it's looking at how the defensive line was doing, we had some linebackers that played some really well. And then we had, like, Nick Troy playing well. I mean, Corey was his usual solid self. I thought Chapman had a pretty good game. This team has so many flexible parts. What I don't like, and I'll go back to it, is Lep and his issues with getting some of these coverage calls in there, because that really was frustrating to me, especially the fact that, come on, man, you're now like almost a season and a half, a little bit more than that, as the defensive coordinator and the safeties coach. There's got to be a much better communication plan in order to have these safeties in the right spot. Chapman got burned, and sure, you can, as a UTSA fan, you can say, he should have known better, but there's just got to be better communication there, because this is just the umpteenth time that you're seeing the same issue.
But last year that would have happened like 3 or 4 times.
Right. But the problem is it's still happening.
Yeah.
And I think it happened more than we care to admit during the game. Houston just wasn't able to take advantage of it because of that defensive line. So I just think that, if we're really going to hold somebody accountable, it can't really be the players. I think this is a LEP issue, and I think this is something that these communication issues, you see what a good AAC team can do. So,
yeah.
Something just to think about as we move away from Conference USA this year and go up to the AAC next season. Okay, let's talk players of the game. I think I've kind of already gushed about these players, but might as well just rehash it a little bit. For defense, it's defensive line. I just felt like they just played so well. I can't gush enough about Lamont McDougall and Joe Evans as a duo. Thought they caused a ton of problems in overtime. Cyrus Simon gets his big paw up and smacks a pass down. It's just the play of that line that I think is going to make this defense much more special. Going on to the offense, it's not even a question. It's Frank. Frank's scrambles, especially being under duress for just about the entire game. His poise in delivering the ball to every single receiver. I'll be honest with you. I think that he's, based on what I saw from this game, I think he's in for a very special season. It may not seem as statistically great as maybe, say, last season, but I just think he is truly going to, I think, finally, in my eyes, hit his potential.
Well, and Conference USA apparently agrees with you because Frank was named the Conference USA Offensive Player of the Week. And I know you don't normally do a special team player of the game, but Jared Sackett was also named Conference USA Special Teams Player of the Week. So it's a pretty nice welcome back for Jared Sackett right there.
Yeah, again, I thought the UTSA players deserved everything because, again, they really played well. And, based on some of these other teams that played in Conference USA, these guys popped, especially against a quality opponent. So let's get into the Army preview. We actually watched the Coastal Carolina Army game because we're sickos like that. And not just because we wanted to do this for the preview here, but really because we wanted to get a sense of what we're going to see. It has been 2 years since we've seen Army. I think there's not much, new to learn about them, except just to say, even though nothing changes, it's still difficult to stop them.
Sure.
So let's start on offense. They use two quarterbacks, Cade Ballard and Tyler. Ballard is a guy that we should actually remember if you were watching the Army game 2 seasons ago in the Dome. He's, I think, their better passer, but he was also completed the one pass in that game, which I think was about 40 yards. Lulled our secondary to sleep and completed about a 40-yard bomb. When I say he's a good passer, I'm not talking about Frank Harris good. I'm just talking about the fact that from an option quarterback viewpoint, he's definitely much more accurate. I think Tyler's probably a better scrambler and runs the option pretty well. They love to attack the middle and the right side. The right side is mostly the strong side, but that's where they like to attack. So that means that if we're looking at the defense, UTSA's defense as it's set up now, we're talking about them going straight at really Joe Evans. So that's, I think, going to be a challenge for Joe. And I think maybe potentially either Jamori Robinson or Trey Moore. I think those are the outside linebackers are going to be out there. Harmonson and Ligon are going to have their hands full as well. But I think that if there are any changes made, it might be bringing in an extra lineman, maybe two. You don't know. I just don't know if you want to really soak up all of your defensive line depth by bringing in so many linemen at that time. But it could be something they use to combat that option.
Yeah, in the Coastal Carolina game, it was interesting. They actually had 2 passing touchdowns, one from each of the quarterbacks. And you could just tell during the game that because there was so much focus on the run, both times that they threw a pass, just sort of lulled Coastal Carolina into forgetting that, these quarterbacks can throw. And so they just really weren't ready for it.
And what happens is that your secondary starts peeking in the backfield. They just started looking in the backfield, and because they know that if one of the rushers squirts free, and it happened on a counter where they set him up on essentially a rusher on the left side and then handed off, and he went to the right and then just broke and just accelerated about 70 yards for a touchdown. the secondary gets caught peeking in there because they're afraid of something like that. Because then they're the ones that are usually the ones that are going to have to like chase these guys down.
Yeah.
And there was one case in that first touchdown by Army where you said, oh wow, that guy, if he had only had like a couple more yards, he would have stopped him short of the goal line. It was a secondary guy. I think it was one of the cornerbacks, and I think he's one of the ones that got lulled into the touchdown pass into giving up that long pass. So certainly something to watch out for on defense. This Army offense is all about precision, so you're just gonna have to be careful with them. I would say you're gonna have to make sure that that middle of the defensive line is shored up, especially the middle of our defense. Gonna have to tackle. Like, I thought the tackling has really improved.
Yeah.
I didn't see any. I would say saw very few problems. If you want to really nitpick, yeah, you saw some missed tackles, but they were tired by the end. Just remember what I just said. We don't want to get the defense tired because that leads to arm tackles and leads to bigger Army gains, and that's how they kind of,
wear
really
you down. Yeah.
And the last thing again was something we already talked about: secondary getting lulled. Can't have the secondary really peeking in the backfield too much. Clifford Chapman got caught on that touchdown pass to Tank Dell looking in the backfield, and he didn't really realize that he was supposed to be covering Dell. Again, we talked about the kind of handoffs in the secondary. He can't be caught looking in there too much, or else he's going to get burned for a big play. All right, on defense, you got to watch out for Andre Carter, and I think he's going to be good to go. He did go down late in the Coastal Carolina game. It didn't look too severe, but it was, I think, a lower leg injury. I believe that it was a cramp. I could be wrong. I looked up to see if he's on any sort of injured list or they had any reports yet, and there was nothing that they showed. So I'm guessing he's going to be good to go. He's a problem, especially with our issues at right tackle. That's exactly where he's going to be lining up. He's going to be coming after Frank. I believe he's about 6'7", 250, 60 pounds.
Yeah, and apparently he is really heavily being scouted and is potentially a first or second round NFL draft pick for this next draft. So
Roadrunner fans, when we talk about like things to worry about, it's Andre Carter, an NFL draft pick potentially going up against a walk-on and Frankie Martinez on the right tackle spot. If you don't think that we're now going to go to a potentially 12 personnel with getting tight ends in there, doing some chipping and helping out against Carter, then you probably have been drinking a little bit too much already, because that's exactly what's going to happen. And what needs to happen, because of the fact that you just can't leave Frank's blind side open like that. It's just not going to be, it's going to be a recipe for disaster, to be honest with you. Other than that, I don't think that the defense is overall special. I could be wrong, but from the Coastal Carolina game, I mean, I didn't see anything. I mean, they're physical. They, again, are disciplined. But that doesn't mean that they can't be exploited. Did you see anything else that I may have missed in terms of their defense?
No, I definitely think that after facing the Houston defense, again, if we can stay focused and stay disciplined, and we, on the O-line, can shore it up a little bit, and hopefully Frankie or Ernesto Almaraz will be healthy enough to play and they'll be good to go. I think we should be okay. My biggest concern about playing Army is just, again, are we going to be able to stay healthy on the O-line? And, is Almaraz going to be healthy enough to play? And if not, is Frankie going to be ready?
And those are good points. I will add to this here then for the keys on offense. I think they need to mimic some of the things that Coastal Carolina did. Establish that run game. Coastal Carolina is an option-based team, so they also need, time, but they're also kind of explosive in terms of passing, because they actually pass more than Army does. That said, one of the things that Coastal Carolina did really well is they started chewing up that time of possession. They were efficient. And it works a couple ways here, because A, you keep drives going, you score on those drives, but B, the biggest thing is you also give your defense a breather, because that Army offense is so meticulous and they're going to take up a lot of time that you don't want to get caught being over anxious on offense. Quick strike is a killer in this. Yeah, it can work, but in 2018, Oklahoma played Army in Norman, and they had to go to overtime to beat Army in Norman, and it was 28-21. Overall, the Oklahoma offense was quite efficient. There was a lot of positives to them, but because they could
Score
they were
too quickly.
yeah, they were scoring. I mean, I think they had the ball, I want to say about like 10, maybe 15 minutes in the entire game. Out of a 60-minute game, I mean, that's an Oklahoma defense that's a P5, a G5 defense. Like UTSA cannot afford to be on the field for 45 minutes. So this offense is going to have to be patient and be efficient. And I think if they stick to sort of a shorter passing game and just kind of stacking first downs, kind of like even what I said about Houston was stacking up yards, keeping drives going, we're going to be in a good spot. That said, for the way too early prediction, I'm concerned about the emotional letdown after the Houston game. You talked about with Traylor, is he still kind of down today? You know, do we see that hangover going into West Point? The offensive line injuries are a major concern. Again, we just talked about Andre Carter lining up against potentially, a walk-on and Frankie Martinez. It's not that we don't believe in Frankie Martinez, but that's just...
He just hasn't had a lot of playing time.
And that's just a recipe for disaster, especially for Frank on his blind side. I think both offense and defense for UTSA are going to be able to find success. But the question to me is it just going to be a flash, or is it going to be sustained success throughout the entire game? I kind of feeling like it's going to be flashes, and that I think is going to be a recipe for, I'm not going to say disaster, but a recipe for a defeat here. So due to that emotional letdown and due to the concerns in the offensive line, and based on what we know right now, on Monday night, I'm going to say, give me Army 27-24 over UTSA.
All right, before we go, let's talk a little bit about some of the games from around Conference USA this past weekend. UNT fell to SMU 48-10. For those of you who were concerned about the attendance at the UTSA Houston game, just a little fun fact for you. There were only 25,306 people in attendance in Denton for a game that involved two teams from the Metroplex. So, yeah, should not be disappointed in what we were able to achieve at home.
I thought something that was interesting was that I believe there's somebody from UNT that talked about it not being a rivalry. I thought that was hilarious. It's like, I think, like Texas State not saying it, like trying to make a rivalry with UTSA in football, where it's like they just keep getting blown out, and that's what UNT keeps happening with SMU. They keep getting blown out. So I just thought it was funny, a funny tweet that I came across.
FAU lost to Ohio 41-38. Apparently that was a pretty crazy game.
Shocker, though, I would say, especially for FAU, like kind of establishing being a pretty good team in Conference USA. Not sure why they're losing to Ohio, but hey.
Yeah, Western Kentucky beat Hawaii 49-17. And then UAB shut out Alabama A&M 59-0.
There was a really good moment there right before halftime. Bill Clark was there. He had a back brace on, and the players went up to him and kind of took a knee, and really just it was just a good moment seeing their essentially former coach greeting them. He was treated exactly like with the respect that he has, I think, earned, and watching it was like, I wish there was a moment like that had happened maybe with Coker, maybe during the 2016 season after he was let go. I get that, it's probably not great after you have to let go of the coach, and in this case it was a coach that had to resign due to health reasons, but it was still really, it kind of got you in the feels a little bit seeing the way that they just looked at Bill Clark. And really, again, Bill Clark, hope he's feeling better, because it's tough to not see him on the sidelines, coaching his butt off and racking up some wins for UAB.
You want to talk a little bit about the games in soccer recently?
Yeah, so I was able to watch actually both games, but I was able to watch the Stetson game. I was actually delayed a day, and really what I saw was, again, this team is pretty good. I think when they are facing, teams that are maybe close to their level, they're doing a better job of not playing down to the level of some of these teams. And I felt like against Stetson, they could have played down to them. They didn't, and I'll say this, in that 3-0 victory, you kind of saw the special in Anna Suter. I've kind of talked about her in the preview, and I've kind of talked to her again. She had two great goals where I think normal Conference USA players don't make the plays that she does to get that ball in the net, back of the net, but she did. And, good to see her start really, I'd say, start getting on a roll here. I thought the team defense was terrific. I still think that the UTSA middle of the field midfielders really are struggling. If they only had, I think, a little bit of stronger play there, I think this team would really be a team to be reckoned with, because it really showed against South Florida when they played them on Sunday. They really struggled at times. South Florida was definitely the better team. You could tell if South Florida actually had players that I should go back and say, if they had offensive players that could put the ball in the back of the net like Anna Suter could, I think this game could have gotten a little bit out of hand for South Florida. It just felt like UTSA was just trying to stay on the field with South Florida. Now, some of this could have been because that game with Stetson was, essentially had to be a day later, so there was a day less of recovery. But to be honest with you, South Florida controlled the ball and looked like the best team that UTSA has faced all season, to include Baylor in the preseason game. I didn't feel like UTSA was in the same class as South Florida in that game.
But they held them almost all the way to the very end.
They did.
South Florida didn't score until, a couple minutes left in the game?
But I think that speaks more to South Florida not being able to have those forwards that can close the game. There was, to me, a very embarrassing moment for South Florida in which one of the players got around our defense and essentially just had to take a left-footed shot and would have scored against our goalie. Instead, she kicked it, and it was like the first time she's ever kicked the ball because it went off to the... She just shanked it off to the left. And it was just a terrible kick, and she was like... You could tell how angry she was with herself, and she should be, because those are like rookie mistakes. Those aren't like college soccer mistakes. There I thought UTSA got away with one, but South Florida kept knocking on the door then near the end of the game, and it just seemed like it was a matter of time before they scored. So, tough loss, but I still think the ladies should come back held high. To your point, they held their own against a team that was clearly at least a couple levels higher than they were.
So they'll be back at Park West on Sunday at noon to play their last out-of-conference game against Stephen F. Austin. And then they'll start conference play on Wednesday at 7 p.m., again at Park West against Rice. So go out and support the ladies if you have the opportunity. Well, I think that about wraps it up for us today. So thank you for joining the Hail Mary podcast. I'm A. Toves.
And I'm the Toves.
We'll be back next week, and hopefully Ben will be wrong about his Army forecast, and we'll be talking about a victory.
Okay. Birds up.